I was 19 years old. I didn't know what a deed was. I didn't know what probate meant. I didn't know the difference between a will and a trust, or what executors were legally allowed to do, or what happened when they did. Something they were not legally allowed to do at all. I was 19. I was grieving. And the two people in the world who were supposed to guide me through both of those things were the exact same two people who were quietly, carefully, and completely illegally selling the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. By the time I found out, I was 24 years old. 5 years. They had 5 years of thinking they had gotten away with it. They were wrong. My name is Lily. I'm 29 years old now. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in an apartment I chose myself, in a city I moved to specifically because it was mine, not inherited. Not handed to me. Not taken from me either. Just mine. But this story starts a decade ago in a small town in rural Georgia, a town so small it had one grocery store, one church, one school, and one woman who made it worth living in. My grandmother, Ruth. She was 71 years old when she died. Small woman, enormous presence. The kind of person who remembered every birthday without writing it down, who made biscuits from memory at 5 in the morning, who kept a garden so beautiful that people drove past her house slowly just to look at it through the window. She had a house, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, an oak tree in the backyard that she had planted the year my mother was born, a kitchen that smelled permanently of vanilla and coffee no matter what time of day you walked into it. And 6 months before she died, 6 months before the cancer that had been quietly growing in her lungs finally took everything it wanted, she sat me down at that kitchen table and told me something I was not expecting. She told me the house was mine. She had already spoken to her attorney. She had already signed the documents. She had already made it legal and official and finished. She wanted me to know while she was still sitting across from me at that table, still able to watch my face when she said it. She said, and I remember this exactly word for word, the way you remember the last important thing someone says to you. Lily, this house is your foundation. Whatever life throws at you, you will always have somewhere solid to stand. I cried. She handed me a biscuit. We sat together in that kitchen for another 2 hours talking about nothing and everything. 4 months later, she was gone. And 6 months after that, though I did not know it yet, so was the house. Before I go any further, I want to stop and connect with you for a moment. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment on these videos and I genuinely want to know who is sitting with me through this story. Because if you have ever been young and grieving and trusting, if you have ever believed that the people closest to you were protecting you when they were actually protecting themselves, then this story is for you. Okay, let's keep going. I need to tell you about my parents before I can tell you what they did. Not because I want your sympathy for them, but because understanding who they were makes what happened make a particular kind of terrible sense. My father, Gerald, was my grandmother's son, her only son. He had grown up in that house, had learned to ride a bike on that driveway, had carved his initials into the oak tree in the backyard when he was 8 years old, had left for college at 18 and come back at 22 with my mother on his arm and a set of expectations about how his life was going to unfold. Those expectations had not entirely materialized. My father worked in insurance sales. He was not bad at it. He was also not particularly good at it. He moved between companies every few years, always with a reasonable explanation, always with a new opportunity just around the corner. My mother worked part-time at a dental office and managed the household and managed my father's optimism about the next opportunity with a patience that I mistook for contentment for most of my childhood. We were not poor. We were also not comfortable. We lived in the specific financial register that involves always being almost fine, where the car needs something and the timing is never quite right and the vacations happen every other year and the word budget is used. The way other families use the word weather, constantly, neutrally, as simple background fact. My grandmother's house was, by any objective measure, worth real money. Rural Georgia land values had been climbing for years. The property was paid off entirely, no mortgage, no liens, completely clear. A local real estate agent had told my grandmother years earlier that the property alone, without the house, was worth more than most people in that town made in 5 years. My father knew this. He had always known this. And when my grandmother sat me down at that kitchen table and told me the house was mine, I don't know if she told him directly, or if he found out through the estate process, or if he had simply always assumed that as her son he would inherit it regardless of what she wanted. What I know is what happened. And what happened was this. My grandmother died on a Thursday morning in October, when I was 19 years old and 3 months into my first year of community college, an hour away from home. My mother called me. I drove home. I sat with my family through the funeral and the gathering afterward and the specific exhausted grief of the days that follow when everyone has gone home and the casseroles run out and the absence becomes permanent. I was 19. I was devastated. I trusted my parents completely. My father told me there was paperwork to handle. Estate things. He said he would take care of it. He said I didn't need to worry about it. He said grieving was my only job right now and he would handle the details. I said, okay. I went back to school. I trusted him. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it entirely. About 8 months after my grandmother died, I drove back to her town to visit a friend who still lived there. I turned onto my grandmother's street. I don't even know why. Some automatic pull toward the place. The way grief sometimes steers your car before your brain decides anything. And there was a family on the porch. A woman watering plants in containers she had brought herself. 2 children running in the yard. A man checking the mailbox. I slowed down. I told myself I was confused. That I had turned onto the wrong street. That the house just looked similar from the road. I drove around the block and came back slowly. Same house, same oak tree, same wraparound porch. Different family? I called my father from the parking lot of a gas station 2 blocks away. My hands were not quite steady on the phone. He answered on the 3rd ring. I said, Dad, there are people living in Grandma's house. There was a pause that lasted slightly too long. Then he said, oh, yeah, honey. I meant to talk to you about that. We ended up having to make some decisions with the estate. It got complicated. I'll explain everything when you're home. Complicated. I held that word in the parking lot of that gas station and felt something start to shift inside me, something I didn't have a name for yet because I was 19 and I had never needed a name for the feeling of being deliberately misled by someone you loved. I drove home that weekend. My father sat me down at our kitchen table, not Grandma's kitchen table, our kitchen table, which is a detail that matters, and he explained that the estate had debts, that there were costs associated with settling everything, that the house had needed to be liquidated to cover those costs, that he had done what he had to do and he was sorry he hadn't explained sooner, but it had all happened very quickly. He said it calmly. He said it with a particular expression of tired practicality that was designed to communicate that this had been painful for him too, and that asking more questions would be unkind. I was 19. I was still grieving. I did not know what estate debts looked like or whether they were real or how you verified them or whether a house explicitly left to a specific person could be sold to cover them without that person's knowledge or consent. I said okay. I went back to school. I tried to forget the woman watering plants on my grandmother's porch. I almost succeeded. Almost. Because the thing about a wrong that has been done to you, the thing nobody tells you when you are 19 and trusting and devastated, is that it doesn't disappear when you stop looking at it. It waits. It waits in the small, uncomfortable moments. It waits in the specific feeling of something not adding up that you keep choosing to push down because the alternative, the thing it would mean if you didn't push it down, is too large and too painful to look at directly. It waited in me for 5 years. And then something happened that made it impossible to look away. I was 24. I was in my 2nd year of working as a paralegal at a small family law firm in Charlotte. I had taken the job because it paid decently and the hours were reasonable and I was good at the organizational work it required. I had not taken it with any thought of my grandmother's house. But knowledge has a way of finding the questions you haven't let yourself ask yet. One afternoon, I was organizing files for a case that involved a disputed inheritance, an elderly woman's property that her children were contesting. My supervising attorney, a careful and thorough woman named Janet, walked me through the relevant property law as she worked. She explained what a will bequest meant legally. She explained what happened when a property was left specifically and exclusively to a named individual. She explained what an executor was and was not permitted to do with such a property. She said, and I remember this moment with absolute precision, the key thing to understand is that a direct bequest to a named beneficiary cannot be sold by an executor to cover general estate debts without the beneficiary's written consent. It's protected. It belongs to that person the moment the will is executed. I stopped typing. I looked at my hands on the keyboard. And 5 years of something I had been pushing down came completely and quietly to the surface. I said very carefully, what if the beneficiary didn't know? What if they were young and they just trusted the executor to handle it? Janet looked at me for a moment. Then she said, how old were you? I told Janet everything that evening after the office closed. She listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys listen, with complete attention and no visible reaction, processing everything before they say a single word. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Lily, what your father did, if it happened the way you've described, was not a complicated estate decision. It was fraud. The word landed in that empty office like something physical. Fraud, not a misunderstanding. Not a painful but necessary decision. Not complicated. Fraud. She told me what I needed to find out. She told me where to look and what to look for and how to request the documents that would tell me the truth in black and white. In legal language, in a form that no amount of calm explanation could reframe. I drove home that night and I sat in my apartment for a long time in the dark. And I made a decision. Not out of anger, though I felt anger deep and cold and completely legitimate. Not out of revenge, though what I was about to uncover would have consequences my parents had never anticipated. Out of something much simpler. My grandmother had sat across from me at her kitchen table and told me that house was my foundation. That whatever life threw at me, I would always have somewhere solid to stand. She had meant it. She had made it legal. And someone had taken it while I was grieving and 19 and trusting and too young to know I was allowed to ask questions. I was 24 now. I knew how to ask questions. The next 3 months were the most methodical of my life. I requested my grandmother's probate records from the county courthouse in Georgia. Public records, anyone can request them, which is something my father had apparently never considered or simply never worried about because he had been so certain I would never know to ask. The documents arrived in a manila envelope on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table and I read every page. My grandmother's will was clear, specific, and unambiguous. The house and property at her address were left exclusively and entirely to me. Lily, named directly with no conditions, no qualifications, no exceptions. There were no estate debts of any significance. A small outstanding utility bill. Funeral costs that had been covered by a separate account my grandmother had maintained specifically for that purpose. There was no legal basis, none, for the sale of that property without my written consent. The sale had been executed by my father as executor of the estate 11 months after my grandmother's death. The property had sold for significantly below market value, which suggested urgency or a private arrangement, or both. The proceeds had gone into an account I had never seen and never been told about. I photographed every page. I organized everything chronologically. I emailed copies to Janet and to a property attorney she referred me to, a man named David Okafor, who specialized in exactly this category of estate fraud. David reviewed the documents and called me the following morning.
He said, "This is one of the clearest cases I've seen."
Your father had no legal authority to sell this property. The sale is voidable, and the question now is what you want to do about it. I asked him what my options were. He told me. And then I made 3 more decisions. 1 phone call, 1 letter, and 1 meeting. That changed everything. I called my parents on a Sunday evening. Not to confront, not to accuse. Simply to tell them I was coming home the following weekend, and I wanted to have dinner together. My mother said that would be lovely. My father said he was looking forward to it. They both sounded exactly as they always sounded, normal, warm, entirely unaware. I arrived on Saturday evening with a folder under my arm. We had dinner. My mother had made the roast she always made when I came home. My father talked about a new opportunity at work. Everything was ordinary and comfortable and completely familiar. And then I placed the folder on the table. I opened it, and I walked them through every document, the will, the probate records, the sale records, the account statements, David Okafor's written legal assessment, in exactly the order Janet had advised me to present them. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I spoke in the same calm, organized tone I used in the office when I was presenting case materials, because that is exactly what this was. My father's face went through several distinct expressions in the space of about 90 seconds. Confusion first. Then something that tried to be the same calm practicality he had used 5 years earlier. Then, when it became clear that every document on the table made that practicality impossible, something that collapsed inward and became very small and very still. My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father said, "Lily, it was complicated. There were things you didn't understand." I said, "I've had an attorney review everything, Dad. The will was unambiguous. The sale was illegal. I'm giving you the opportunity to discuss this privately before we move to the next step." The next step being formal legal proceedings, which David Okafor was entirely prepared to initiate. The silence at that table lasted a very long time. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom scene. It was something quieter, and in some ways harder, a series of difficult and honest conversations mediated by attorneys. A negotiated settlement that could not restore exactly what had been taken but could provide meaningful compensation, and a formal legal acknowledgement of what had happened. My father signed a settlement agreement 6 months later. The family who had purchased the house, innocent buyers who had known nothing, kept their home. That was always going to be the right outcome. They had done nothing wrong. But what my grandmother had intended for me, the financial foundation she had worked her entire life to leave, was accounted for legally, formally, in a document with signatures and a notary stamp. My grandmother's attorney, who had drafted the original will and had retired to Florida, was contacted during the process. He told David that Ruth had been very specific, very deliberate, and had understood completely what she was doing when she named me as her sole beneficiary. He said she had told him, "My son will be fine. My granddaughter needs to know she has ground beneath her feet." She had known. She had planned for me. And in the end, even 5 years late, even through a process that cost more than it should have and hurt more than anything should, she was right. "I don't speak to my father right now." That's a sentence I never imagined I would say. And I want to be honest with you, it doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel satisfying in the way that justice in stories is supposed to feel. It feels like loss. It feels like the specific grief of understanding that someone you loved was capable of something you cannot fully reconcile with who you believed they were. My mother and I speak occasionally, carefully. There. Is love there, damaged and complicated and requiring enormous care to hold without breaking further, but real. She knew, I believe. Or she knew enough. What she does with that knowledge is her work to do, not mine. What I have done with mine is this. I took the settlement and I was deliberate with every dollar of it. I completed my paralegal certification. I started a savings account I named, privately, in my own records, Ruth. I began slowly and carefully, building the financial foundation my grandmother had tried to give me. It looks different than she imagined. The house is gone. The oak tree she planted when my mother was born is in someone else's backyard now. But the intention behind it, the love that motivated it, the determination that I should always have somewhere solid to stand, that I carry with me, into every decision, into every document I organize at work, into every young person I see who doesn't know yet that they have rights, that the law exists for them too, even when the people they trust are the ones it needs to protect them from. There is something I want to say directly to anyone who is young and grieving and trusting right now. Your grief is not a weakness. Your youth is not an excuse for what someone else chose to do with it. Your lack of knowledge at 19 about estate law and probate records and property rights is not a failure. It is simply the result of being 19, which is not a crime. The crime, if there was one, belonged to the person who looked at your grief and your trust and your youth and saw an opportunity instead of a responsibility. You are allowed to ask questions, even years later. Even when asking them means looking at something painful. Even when the answer changes everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. My grandmother sat across from me at her kitchen table and told me I would always have somewhere solid to stand. She was right. It just took me 5 years, a paralegal job, a good attorney, and the willingness to open a folder at my parents' dinner table to find it. But I found it. And if someone has taken something from you, if someone has used your trust or your grief or your inexperience to help themselves to what was meant for you, know this. Records exist. Documents are public. Attorneys take cases. And the law, imperfect and slow and sometimes maddeningly complicated as it is, was built exactly for the moment when the people who should have protected you chose not to. You are allowed to use it. Go find what belongs to you. If this story meant something to you tonight, if it touched something you have been carrying, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story about inheritance, family betrayal, or discovering your rights too late, leave it in the comments below. Every single one matters. I'll be reading them.